Okay, I'm going to be talking about chapter 2 now in your textbook. He spends a lot of time in here talking about facts, concepts, and higher level concepts. And a very good way to grasp this is to look all the way over on the little exercise on page, I think it's 40, let me see where I put that, yeah, 42. It's the chart. I've used something like this in the past. It's very useful. It's right across from also the table 2.3. It talks about a particular thing called a rite of passage, and it compares marriage ceremony, funeral, christening ceremony, baptism, bar mitzvahs. These are signs called a rite of passage, which people go through, which indicate, well, moving on to a different stage in their life or afterlife. And so that's by bundling together similar human approaches in society to deal with transitions in life, it has this aha moment where a person can take a look at this and see, oh, I see what a bar mitzvah is. It's like the quinceañera that a young girl has in Mexican and Hispanic culture, some aspects of Hispanic culture. Another thing that would be similar as a transition is what used to be called the debutante dance, which is a presentation, and this is actually done in very high society still. We don't do it. We do go through transitions, though. If you can imagine, another transition would be graduating high school, getting your driver's license, your first kiss, maybe, and other items along those lines. You can imagine. First bicycle, and we can all go through and we can relate to those. And this is why this is how concepts need to be taught. You cannot use facts. I mean, facts, we want facts. We don't want fake facts. There are no fake facts. They're not facts if they're fake. I don't care who you are. But the point is that you want to develop bits and pieces of information that help bring together an understanding of a culture. Now, numbers mean nothing. We're bombarded by these in this culture. We're always saying that, well, this will add 350 billion to the deficit, or 2 trillion will be spent on Medicare or the military over a 10-year period. That doesn't impress anybody. It means nothing to anybody, really. They don't care about that. I think that what we face in our society is we're just stunned by numbers, or else we're indifferent to them. We've had someone try to tell you that this is $2 million or this is something extraordinary. Those things don't impress us. The things that impress us are stories. Stories are something so ancient. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a hero that goes on a journey. I often talk about a thing called the Joseph Campbell's cycle of the hero adventurer who goes in. The original, of course, is the Iliad and the Odyssey, where Achilles and Odysseus and the Greeks go and fight the Trojan War, and then Odysseus tries to return home. It takes him 10 years to get from Asia Minor over to Greece, which is about a 2-hour flight. It takes him 10 years to get there. Now, is it a factual story? Probably not, although it is compiled from millions or hundreds of thousands of stories of people that have gone on journeys and survived. And they always warn you on those cycles, the heroic cycle, that a lot of people don't survive. When you take a chance and you go somewhere, there's a risk you won't come back. Those stories can be surviving cancer. They can be surviving service in the military. Um, Saving Private Ryan is a great example of that. And so when it talks here about concepts, the word concept's a little vague, and what people grasp is they grasp a story. I used to have a tape of a young girl's 15th birthday ceremony, quinceañera. I probably say that a little bit wrong, but and you may be familiar with in Hispanic culture with that, and it's connected with a party, people in the community supporting the young lady, and it basically there's a church ceremony involved with it, and finally there's a dance, and the community comes out and they wish her well. And this is a coming out party. This is saying that this young lady is now a woman in society. And often those are bigger than the weddings. In our culture, the one I grew up in, Midwestern, the wedding is the big ceremony. And they may be even bigger ceremony for other people. Depends on how much money they have and how important it is. So, so when you teach about concepts, you're teaching with stories, and remember that. Don't fall into quoting statistics and peculiar little. I mean, I love all kinds of odd bits of information about things. They mention in here about Chinese immigrants forming groups in the late 1800s to protect themselves. Social organizations. What kind of social organizations do we have from the Middle Ages? Well, we have the Masons, Masonic orders. We have the Knights of Columbus. We have later on in other cultures, we may be a certain society within Native Americans. I think they formed groups, and I'd have to go back. It's been a long time since I've heard this, but they would form societies within their tribes, and men would be members of these. These can be for men, they can be for women. I've been mentioning the Rites of Passage, the formation of gangs by groups and poor communities. We can go back and look at and see, this is where you have to be careful with the generalization. If you say certain groups form gangs, this was a very sensitive issue when the movie The Godfather came out in 1971, and most of you have seen The Godfather. People would say, oh, Italian Americans or Sicilians, they're criminals. They'd say, kind of like what Trump said, and he classified Mexicans as murderers instead of these terrible things, is that when you yell something like that, you stain the whole culture. And it's a lie. People should know that's a lie, what Trump said. And if I talking on here about different groups, generalization, I always tell people generalization is something that is a guess. It would seem to be true of the society in general. You may make some observation about a certain group and say, well, they're usually very punctual, or maybe they don't put a great emphasis on friendship. We laugh and joke, and the culture I identify with, whatever you want to call it, Midwestern, is that, you like your friends, you'll do anything for your friends, but you won't loan them money because that ruins friendships. But I know of other cultures where if you say, I'm your friend, then if your friend needs it, you will give them $1,000. I knew of once, and this is just a story. It doesn't mean it's true of all Koreans, but I knew a Korean guy that had another Korean gentleman that was his friend, and he said, I really need money to get my girlfriend from Korea over here. And the guy gave him his savings account, $2,000. And it turned out that the Korean man that wanted the money, he was dishonest and he lied. So he violated the rules of Korean friendship. There are all kinds of obligations. If you're a friend with someone, what are your obligations? Every culture, I think, probably has friendship. I'm saying that tentatively because I don't want to say every. They caution against absolutes in here. So you approach everything with a little bit of caution. You especially have to be very careful about anything that can be perceived as negative. Any kind of statement, all Americans are this, or most Americans are this way. Most would sound nice, but it depends on what comes after it, okay? An effective multicultural curriculum tries to give a balanced vision of that culture. They have some places in there they talk about it. I'm going to go back to that chart. It does the comparison of different groups. If you look on page 42, it talks about Filipinos, British Pakistanis, French Canadians, Nigerian Igbos, Mexican Indians, and French Algerians. So it's talking about a groups, and these are very specific. It's saying, are they discriminated against within the culture they're inside? And you got British Pakistanis, and you know, with the Islamic fear of terrorism, that in England there have been political parties, as in Europe and the United States, really, there's been fear against Muslims. And British Pakistanis are almost always going to be Muslims. How are they treated? What about Filipino Americans in the U.S.? Are they Muslims? No. But they are a minority. Are Filipinos discriminated against? French Canadians. Now, here's where the idea of the concept really works, is that rather than fall into the trap of talking about something that your students probably are very familiar with or have heard generalizations about, or in effect, I'm saying stereotypes. For instance, who gets mistreated? We have Native Americans in the United States, and we have Native peoples, Indians that lived in Mexico. Have they been mistreated? What is the way Mexico has treated their Native American population since the conquest? A long time ago, 500 years ago. And they ask some questions here on the side. I like this chart because it forces people to do research and to find out the answers. So they're looking for facts, but they're also looking for stories. And I want to say that word again, story, because stories are what we like. We can remember a story. I have students that I may not remember their name. I'll remember their face, but I tell you, they'll tell me a couple of things and they'll tell me a story. And I'll remember students told me, well, I used to go on the back of our farm, and I had this old tree. I would go up there, and that's where I'd read books. And I thought it was so unusual someone would read books in a tree. You know, sounds like Abraham Lincoln stuff. There's another myth. You know, the story of Abraham Lincoln, how much is not true and how much is true. So we can go and compare groups, and this is where you get into cognitive, intellectually challenging ways to have students make discoveries on their own through research or through reading stories about the life of other groups and compare them. For instance, how were French Canadians who were discriminated against by the English in Canada, how were they treated? And maybe compare that to a group in the United States, German Americans. Were German Americans ever discriminated against? You bet. But when? And you may go back and say, well, sometimes in the 1800s, but especially during World War I, World War II, there's a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States. So being a German or being too German was very dangerous. There's even a case of a German in Illinois who was lynched in around World War I. I remember stories my dad told me about people during the 20s and stuff, people that were very pro-German, and that there was a lot of hatred toward them because the propaganda and the stories and whatever you want, however you want to say it, came about. There was a very anti-German feeling in the United States during and after World War One, and some people blame on British propaganda and American newspapers. Obviously, against the Japanese, against the Chinese during the 40s and the 50s, and communism, the Russians, now the Russians again. So as we look at these categories, and it talks about are the groups youths experiencing problems in schools. You can certainly make that case for all kinds of minority groups in the United States. And then the argument then is to find the stories and say, who's responsible? And why is there a movement called Black Lives Matter, and does it matter? Well, I think it matters very much, but you can see a lot of backlash against that group. In fact, it's just backlash and backlash. It's like people whipping each other, bullwhips, constantly, hitting each other. I've got one for you, and I think it's really quite interesting. Portrayal of Appalachian people in the United States historically. And are they being treated that way now? Now, you happen to know a lot of them voted for Trump for president. But now there's this division in the United States where people are very quick to use the term white trash and to show indifference to individuals who are poor, happen to be white and poor from Appalachia and in rural areas of southern states. It's almost like the rural areas against the cities in a lot of these places. And do you find people, you can easily now, and I see it abundantly on Facebook, people are angry about this past election. So they engage in very destructive behavior toward the individuals that voted for the person that won or lost, Hillary supporters, Trump supporters. Before it was Obama and Romney and anti-Mormon feeling. But we can go back. We can go back to the Civil War. We can go back to before that if we want to. We can find these regional animosities through American history. Nothing is more interesting than sometimes going back. I remember reading about the history of my county, Macon, Missouri, during the Civil War, and how many people there were murdered because they supposedly engaged in support for the Southern Confederacy. And I think there were some guys that actually they were captured and they had to promise never to fight for the South again, but they did it again, and they weren't in uniform. They were literally rebels in the sense that they were not in uniform of the Confederate Army. And these men were hanged. They were hung in Macon. I think there were 7 or 8 of them. I remember reading in the history of our county, 1896, a man who almost certainly was innocent, African-American man, was accused of hurting children or molesting children, and there was no trial. He was removed from the jail and he was executed. He was hung from a railway bridge. And what's so shocking about it is that no one claimed any responsibility for doing it, but virtually the whole town took part in taking him out of jail, beating up the sheriff and some ministers that tried to intervene and murdering the guy. And they left his body hanging from the railroad bridge for so long that the railroad threatened to sue the town if they didn't cut it down because it was so, it was decaying. And I uncovered this little story and I'd heard about it. But there were, from what I could gain from people even now, the older people, there were people who didn't want to talk about it. And apparently there was a photo taken of his body after he was murdered. And one of the stories that really struck me was that while they were taking him out to lynch him, They said, "Do you want to be dropped or do you want to be strangled?" And the man said, "It doesn't matter to me because I'm innocent. What you're doing is wrong." And and what had happened is he was accused of stealing bread, but because they had not found this person who had committed this crime against children. And see, I don't even know if that was even done. I have no idea. But they decided that they'd blame it on this African-American man, and he was murdered. 1896. And there are even stories about where he was buried. I've heard from a person who thinks they know where he was buried, but there was never any marker there because the town refuses to acknowledge that they did this, even though we know a vast number of people lived in Macon in the summer of 1896 committed this terrible crime. But, you heard of this during the Civil Rights Movement, but this was not an unusual occurrence at all. So stories like that, well known within the African-American community and maybe among other minorities that suffered similar certain terrifying events, those individuals, they keep that. And so when you look at Black Lives Matter and modern violence, police shootings of African Americans, justification or not, and you look at the history and you see a continuity, then the concept of long-term discrimination and a lack of justice, that comes into view. You may say in this case, we certainly know lynching, there was no justice. It was just plain murder because a group of people got it in their heads that someone was guilty. That's why we have courts to try people. Courts don't always bring justice, and we know that. Some people get off, but we have to have a system. Whether the system we have now is really fair to certain groups, I think is very questionable. Okay, well, those are the main things in this chapter. And I just want to, they have a lot of terms in here: cultural assimilation, structural assimilation. It's easy to fall in trying to memorize the terms, but it is very important to remember facts are critical. Research is important to find out the truth, and it has to be done as much as possible by the very students discovering these stories, because this will change their thinking once they understand. Another group that suffered a lot are farmers. Now, I'm not talking about discrimination, but injustice in terms of economics. I don't know if you're a farmer, but my father was a farmer. I decided not to be a farmer, taught college, school, and small farmers didn't really have a chance. That was our feeling. I haven't really examined the facts, but I know in the early 1980s that a lot of farmers went out of business. And larger farms have survived. In Nebraska, a lot of people are very successful, are farms, but they don't have 160 acres like a section or whatever they call that, or a quarter of a section. They have thousands of acres, and they're very successful. But farmers had to incorporate, and they had to go into larger units to be successful. And a lot of the people that used to farm are no longer farming. They may be working factory jobs or retail jobs or something. And we've got the whole issue in the country of the rural areas are not doing very well. Okay, so before you reach a conclusion, spend a lot of time examining the facts. This would mean I think people are very quick to take offense if they believe you're pushing an agenda. And so you have to create lessons that are open enough that people can discover facts on their own. They can discover stories. They can discover what happened. Or certain groups, it's not very hard to make the case that Native Americans were cheated out of their land. Their land was taken from them. Their culture was destroyed. They were forbidden to speak their language. People know that. it's very hard to make the argument that, well, that's really not fair. We know the injustices to Native Americans, but still there's a lot of discrimination against Native Americans. Now people say a lot of negative things about them. If you cannot create, now listen to this, you cannot respect, first of all, you can't respect yourself intellectually, but you have to examine another culture and look for the beauty in that culture to understand it. It's true of Islam. It's true of Australian Aborigines. It's true of Japanese culture. It's true of any of the countries of the world. I don't care country Y, whatever that country is, or X here. Each of them have beauty in their culture. It could be in art, music, their clothing, their fashion, their language, their mythic stories. Could be there's all these aspects of what culture is. I told you culture is what people do, what they believe, and what they make. And that is the key to understanding and to creating positive attitudes within the community. It may start out with a potluck, people sharing food, and they'll say, well, I really like that. Now, of course, we've adapted really, Mexican food. Now we turned it into Taco Bell. I hope you're not working Taco Bell or own one. I'm offending you. But it's not Mexican food. Just like when I talk to Japanese and Chinese, they say, well, very good restaurants you have here, but it's really not sushi like we're used to. And you know how that goes. Every culture makes its own version of the other culture, or they blend together, you know. Anyhow, that's all I wanted to say about chapter 2, but I want to say it pretty emphatically because it's easy to read this, and sometimes, you know, and I like these focus questions, page 35. It says, music. What does the music of an ethnic group reveal about its values, symbols, and culture? What is the music? What does the language reveal? Language, quite interesting. I mentioned a while ago about handwriting and things in the other video. The formation of our languages and where they came from is fascinating. How many words in our language come from other words? And some of them are very ancient, like the word ma. A similar word means mother in Chinese. Is that accidental but it's coincidental, or is it an actual fact? You know, I mean, is it actually generated from something in a similar root, kind of like evolution? You know a lot of German words, welcome, something like that means welcome in German. So English is a Germanic language as opposed to Spanish and French and Italian and a language called Roman. That's a Romani, the Gypsy language, and also the country of Romania, Romanian. And there's several languages, and some smaller ones you don't know about. They're in the Romance languages. Okay, I'm going to cut her off there. I hope I hit the main points for you. And I took a little snooze just after that last tape, so I'd be a little more refreshed. I'll see you on the Blackboard. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, or as I said before.